Thank you all. If I could just have your attention, we're going to start the next panel. And we're very lucky. It's a very unique panel. We'll be assembling 3 former chiefs of staffs from Republican and Democratic administrations. And I think we all would agree being the chief of staff is probably the second hardest job in the White House. And it puts them at the intersection of policy and politics and priorities and all the things that go through the president's desk. So we're very fortunate to have them. And as the election gets underway, a lot of these issues will come onto the desk of the next president. And I was struck by what Larry Lindsey said earlier. He said if the next president serves 2 terms, that president will propose the 2025 budget, which will have a 10-year plan, and so they'll be projecting out to 2035. So all of the issues we've been talking about will necessarily be confronted by the next president of the United States. And I can think of no better group to help us understand how that next president may be thinking through these issues. So please welcome Andy Card, Josh Bolten, and Bill Daley, and the panel will be moderated by Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post. So please welcome them.
Good down there. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. Not since Jefferson dined alone with his chief of staff has there been such a terrific assortment of folks to talk to about the practical realities of translating from understanding the problem and understanding what to do about it to legislating and governing. But since we're talking about fiscal policy, I think it's really good always to talk about the baseline. So I wanted to get everybody's emotional baseline to sort of figure out where we are in this discussion. So from the spectrum of blissful, serene confidence that we're going to figure out a way to address our fiscal issues in conjunction with opportunity for growth. On the spectrum from blissful confidence to abject despair, could each of you locate yourselves, please? Josh, why don't you start and we'll go down that way.
Okay.
You can stake out your position then.
I am abjectly confident. And what I mean by that is that I think the situation is dire. It has been dire for decades. Our budget trajectory is unsustainable, and that nobody's done a better job of trying to communicate to the public than the folks involved in this conference, the Peterson Institute and the other organizations that are participating here. But it hasn't gotten through, and so our trajectory remains completely unsustainable and remains the largest threat to the prosperity of this nation going forward. I say confident because there are solutions to solve every one of these problems. There are many problems in government are fundamentally just unsolvable. But the fiscal problems that the United States faces are solvable without imposing extreme hardship on the American people. And for that reason, I am confident that when we have finally exhausted all the other avenues, we will find our way to a reasonable solution.
All right, abjectly confident. Pick your phrase.
I would not be as confident as Josh. I think the political process, political system makes that sort of big deal until there's a crisis. And even when there's crises in our system lately, we seem to have the inability to come together and do the big right thing. I would just say that and we're all political in different ways, unless it is a serious part of a discussion in the body politic of the next election, the thought that on January 22nd, somebody's going to stand up and say, I've never talked about this, but here it is, I just don't see that as a scenario. So unless over the next, and obviously the foundation has an enormous number of efforts to try to engage that electorate during the next year and a half. But if it isn't in all the debates there may be no debates for the Democrats, or one person debating herself. But unless it's part of that, I'm not a real confident person that it will be done. Something will be done in a serious way shortly.
All right, Andy, you get to be the deciding vote here.
It's situationally required, but I'm not sure that the discipline will be there because they'll take an excuse to avoid the responsibility if they can. But I think the situation has been so well defined in part by this forum that it cannot be ignored by any candidate. That doesn't mean that it will be raised at every debate or in every forum, but the policy people who help a candidate be a candidate are now put on notice. So I think that situationally they know that they have to be ready to address it. They may find an excuse because of something that happens real time that allows them to be distracted, but I'm quietly confident that they will recognize the responsibility.
It's all in the adverb, quietly confident.
Wait, I wasn't allowed an adverb.
You did. You were abjectly confident.
Oh, okay.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
you were
whatever.
fine. You can have another adverb if you like.
No, that's okay.
And a vowel. So I think it's really important and interesting to talk about the campaign. But first, I want to look backwards a little bit to the fascinating times that each of you spent with two different presidents, more than two different presidents, in the West Wing, and to look back, and maybe, Andy, you're the perfect person to start with, because we did have a campaign where a candidate talked to some extent about addressing fiscal issues and addressing entitlements, won the election, announced that he had capital and he was going to spend it on Social Security reform. Remind us what happened next, but actually, to be more serious, tell us what the lesson is that you took away from that experience in terms of what it takes to accomplish serious fiscal reform.
Well, I give a lot of credit to Josh Bolten, who was the policy leader in the campaign, who did bring discipline for the president to understand what had to be done. And so the president, the candidate, George W. Bush, was committed to solving some of the big problems. And Social Security is a big problem, and he was committed to solving it. And he actually had a plan to go forward, and it wasn't just his plan. He was inviting others to be party to it. So he put together a group of thinkers, and he had great product that was presented. But there were some things that got in the way, not the least of which was the attack on September 11, 2001, that arrested the momentum that we had going in to address some of these significant problems. And then you had, I'm going to say, partisanship on the Hill, so that the audience that had to listen to the solution was distracted and didn't want to take up that charge. That doesn't mean that we didn't offer it to them, but we had a hard time finding traction within our own party, even when they knew it was the right thing to do. But I think that he left a legacy of responsible action, and somebody else can pick up and draw on it. But
what are the lessons that you would take away, other than don't let the homeland be attacked and it'll distract you? What are the serious lessons of governing that you would take away from that unsuccessful effort?
Well, first we have to reach across the aisle to develop credibility.
But you did that.
We did do that. We worked hard to do that. We also invited former members of Congress and the Senate to pay attention to what we were doing. We brought in experts. We formed a committee, and they wrestled and actually came to a strained consensus of a package that we thought could be viable, not unlike what President Reagan did when he transformed some of our entitlement programs. And we were ready to proceed with that. But that fractured when Congress lost the appetite to work together. I do think it's important to work across the aisle. I think, the Judd Gregg and the Kent Conrad, for example, I think those were people who could work together. Different philosophical views, different partisan homes, but they could actually work together to begin to solve the problem. I think the Bowles-Simpson experiment was a valuable experiment, and there was no leadership to bring it to reality. I think if the president had led, it would have produced a bipartisan, strained consensus that would have changed the way we're talking about this issue today.
We may touch on that subject as the discussion goes on, because we have certain people here who might be qualified to speak to it. But first, Josh, I wanted to ask you to build on Andy's comments on not just the lessons of President Bush's efforts on Social Security reform, but other lessons that you took from your time in the West Wing and close by the West Wing about how a president, or whether a president, can really be successful in driving a fiscal reform agenda.
Yeah, I think a president can be successful at it. We were not successful in the Bush administration with even as modest a bite into our fiscal challenges as a Social Security reform plan. But I think a president can be successful, and one of the things it requires is something that President Bush did do, which is you got to campaign on those issues. You have to have some kind of mandate from the people to do stuff that nobody wants to do, which is spend less on stuff that people like. And everybody, you know, the Peterson Institute's polling shows this very clearly. Everybody's for fiscal restraint. Everybody wants smaller government, except they don't, in the aggregate, except that they don't want to cut any individual program, except possibly for foreign assistance, which constitutes less than 1% of the federal budget. So it requires presidential leadership that the president has actually taken to the people and campaigned on. And I believe somebody, a presidential leader who is good at it, whether Democratic or Republican, who has taken the risk of campaigning on it, will get credit from the people for being a responsible campaigner, number one, and number two, will have capital when they actually have to go implement. Now, there's a second part that we did not do well at, which was we didn't have even, Andy, you'll recall, our own party lined up behind the proposals. So when President Bush came out with his Social Security plan, he had campaigned on Social Security reform in 2000. 9/11 and so on intervened. In 2004, he campaigned again on Social Security reform, and you quoted him correctly. He said, "I have political capital. I intend to spend it."
And, you know, every once in a while, a reporter quotes somebody correctly. Yeah. Just, you know, stop the clock.
Yeah. Thank you. And so the president did try to spend that capital. He did, I don't know, Andy, you'll remember 30, 40 events on Social Security reform over the summer of 2005 after that election, and we got nowhere, in part because our own party wasn't behind us, that we didn't have the leadership on Capitol Hill that was prepared to say and stand up and say, yes, we're going to go with the president, because they didn't want to face the political risks involved in it. So presidential leadership involves bringing your own party along. It involves reaching across the aisle. It involves making the case to the public. I believe it all can be done, and it's a hard go, but it's probably the most important thing that we could ask a president to do at this point.
And Bill, you, being a Democrat, you have no experience with the issue of a party not being entirely united behind its president.
Or some would say fiscal soundness.
Talk a little, obviously, there are people on this stage who may have written critically about the president's decision not to go full bore behind Simpson Bowles and to strike at that moment and to exert presidential leadership. Take us back, if you would, to the decision-making in the White House and the discussion inside the White House about the best way to proceed.
The truth is, and this is not a cop-out, the decision not to support it was done right before I got there. Right. I got there in January of 11. The real decision had been made just before that. And I think the real, at least the fact is, there was a strong belief that
was that the, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. So had you been there at the time, would you have been advocating a different course?
I don't know. You know, after the Republicans won the control of the House, and then the House leadership, or the members of Bowles-Simpson, wouldn't vote for it, it was pretty obvious that until, at least this was the political calculation, in my opinion, until they kind of got their act together and they were in charge, which took a very long time, quite frankly, and the rest of the year as we got to the debt ceiling and all that debacle, that fact was still playing out, what control the leadership had on their caucus and all the new members, that the likelihood of that leadership being able to drive through a difficult, go back to Simpson-Bowles, I mean, everybody loves it, but would the American people really have bought into the bulk of what Simpson-Bowles was for? Probably not. And I think the political calculation sure was that until the Republican leadership had control, this was just a nice discussion that would politically never go anywhere. But I'll go back to Josh's comment, and I think it's the most important one, and that is unless the politician is willing in a campaign to engage the American people, this fiscal stability, fiscal soundness, a big deal, will never happen in this town alone if the American people are not involved and aggressively over a long period involved. And that's what the foundation does. So as we go into next year, unless this is the one of the top 2 or 3 issues that people are actually discussing and laying out plans for, I wouldn't sit around dreaming of a big deal next year and a half from now.
So I'm sitting here thinking about whether I'm going to spend any time dreaming of a big deal. Probably not. But I do dream of a campaign where these issues do get addressed in a serious way. And I hear there is a campaign going on. There may be 1 or 2 Republican candidates for president, 1 or 2, maybe 3 Democratic candidates for president. But Josh, you have been in the issue driver's seats of campaigns. Is a campaign a moment when we can and should reasonably expect a candidate to lay out a full fiscal plan and get serious about the contours of entitlement reform? Or as a practical matter, is the best that we can hope for from candidates that they not lock themselves into read my lips type positions, to coin a phrase, where they, sort of the best that we can hope for is a kind of do no harm campaign where when they go into the Oval Office in January of the following year, they won't have locked themselves into a terrible position?
I think that latter is the minimum we should expect from candidates, that is not to lock themselves into a position that prevents them from doing what they know to be or believe to be right ultimately when they govern. I don't think we can expect the candidates to come in with a full-fledged budget and so on, but they ought to approach the issue with some seriousness. Something that we did in the Bush 2000 campaign, of which I was the policy director, was that we designated a member of the policy staff as being the shadow budget director, and that when any other part of the policy staff had a proposal to present, in imitation of how it really works in government, the policy proposal had to go through the guy who was technically the budget director, and there had to be some judgment that it fits. Now, you can't expect campaigns to be in full governing mode. It's only a few people. They're only trying to communicate big ideas. But you can't expect a candidate to be serious about presenting a set of proposals that overall, when looked at as a totality, will put the United States on a sustainable fiscal trajectory. And if they don't do that, their campaigns should be badly judged by the American people and by history.
Bill, you've been involved in a few campaigns in your life. What would you advise a candidate to say or not say on this issue? Not in terms of what's best for the country, but in terms of what's best for the immediate goal of getting elected.
And I know it may be difficult with the way our campaigns have progressed or regressed in the seriousness of them. But I think obviously minimally not to lock yourself into statements that you cannot honestly live with. I do think that you can expect these candidates to be more specific than past campaigns. I think the fact of the matter is the situation we're in demands that. And I think the candidate who has the guts not to lay out a 500-page plan and an actual tax reform or a budget plan, I agree with that. But the major issues to hit them and say what you believe and how you will proceed. I think if we can't expect that, then don't expect to get anything done.
Well,
but it's a bold
open.
risk. I would say, quite frankly, as Hillary Clinton is the only candidate of any note right now in the Democratic Party, I think that would remain. If I was her, I'd be taking a greater risk with more specifics than less, because I think the system.
Explain why. Why should?
First of all, because she doesn't have any opponent, and it looks like it's
well,
going to remain that way.
think
So that's a pretty
like
bold and courageous statement to make. But I think people. I know it may sound Pollyannish, of which is some of my friend Susan Brophy is here knows that's not my normal style, or naive. But I do think the American people are hungry for somebody who's going to lead and be specific and be a little courageous and bold. And if it doesn't happen, so what? I mean, if it does, if you don't get elected, okay, the country goes on. But I think there is a strong desire for that. And my own personal opinion is there's only one person in the whole field on both sides who could deliver that because of her stature.
Andy, what advice would you give to a campaign whose
probably
goal,
why I'm not advising the Hillary Clinton campaign.
Whose goal, after all, is to win? You have to win before you can govern, right?
It's very important to win if you're going to be president.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Andy, let me just say, I agree with you. But enough of that. That's exactly the why. Because you'll do anything and say nothing in order to win, and that's exactly what's happening.
But I do think it's important for the president to have the courage to make tough decisions. I think probably the greatest responsibility for a president is to have the courage to be lonely, because you have to make incredibly difficult decisions that will not make friends, but they're the right decision. And I think it's important that we recognize that while we have all of these love magnets running for president, they also have to have the courage to be lonely if they're going to be a good president. So I would caution a candidate not to take positions that would preclude the opportunity to be lonely and right.
And this is a question of enormous personal interest. Is there something that people in my position in the media can do to try to put pressure on, force these campaigns to be more specific? Because I'm remembering the good old days when people put out you had to put out a detailed campaign manifesto. I'm thinking about Paul Tsongas and putting people first from Bill Clinton and all the, really richly detailed books. Even in the 2008 campaign, I think I had spreadsheets from the Clinton and Obama campaigns that detailed their spending and detailed how they were planning to pay for it. And that kind of specificity seems to have evaporated from our discourse. And I'm actually wondering if there's anything, since you can't tweet it in 140 characters, and that seems to be our dominant mode of political discourse these days, hashtag ad POTUS. Are campaigns, how do you make a campaign susceptible to being pressured into doing what it doesn't want to do, which is to, I don't think instinctively, which is to commit itself to actual numbers and actual plans on paper? Josh? Yeah, you were the issues director.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. I was not the strategist or the political director. Gosh, far be it from me to suggest that you all in the press make yourselves more painful, because that's just not the right way to go.
It's hard to imagine how that could be. All right.
But I think you can do stuff like print a spreadsheet and put it in the Washington Post. It's not I probably still go to the sports section first, but make it something.
They cheat too. So.
Yeah. but make it something that that at least the sophisticated reader can consume. And if a campaign isn't willing to say what their position is, say unwilling to make a position, and show the electorate which candidates are actually willing to take a stand on issues. Because I mean, a lot of it is that the current mode of communicating makes it too easy for candidates not to take stands. So do presentations that indicate who's taken a stand and who hasn't.
So we've gotten through a campaign that has a robust discussion and fully fleshed out spreadsheets and stuff. And I'm going to inflict a terrible hypothetical on you guys. You're back in the Oval Office. You've been made the chief of staff to whoever is the president. He or she calls you in and says, okay, we made it through the campaign. I don't think I tied myself in too much, and I want to be really serious. The last guy and the guy before him, also they didn't want to kick the can down the road on fiscal issues. I really want to be the president who is not kicking the can down the road on fiscal issues. So I want your best advice on two things. A, am I crazy? B, how do I do this? And C, what's my likelihood of success?
Yes, you're crazy, but that's okay. I would actually recommend that you put in a broad outline of what you want to do. Don't negotiate with yourself, but invite others to be part of the same solution, so that you don't lock yourself into it's my way or the highway, because that means you won't get anything done. So I think you want to be directionally correct. You want to invite people to be part of the solution, demonstrate your passion and your resolve, but try to preclude the temptation to have all of the debates take place in the White House. They actually should be with people who have to be part of the solution. And I think if you do that, you can get to a solution. But it takes a lot of courage, because you'll be invited to offer every single specific solution to every aspect of the problem before you submit the bill. And I would say, invite people to be part of that solution by tweaking things here or there and listening and putting people together. Grand Rubin Hollings is a good example of when that happened, and then even the broader debate that resulted in President George H.W. Bush violating the read my lips, no new taxes. But those were negotiations that took place that produced significant results for discipline that lasted a long time, over 10 years.
I would, first of all, I agree with Andy. Yes, you're crazy, but you wouldn't have gotten here if you weren't a little crazy. And I would say, know where you want to go with it. And I always think back to, and then develop a plan. I take a little different tack from Andy. In December, if I remember correctly, in December of 1985, right after President Reagan was reelected, he put forward a tax reform plan. Now, it had been kicking around, Gephardt, Bradley, everybody was running around, but he put out a pretty detailed plan. What ended up out of Congress was nothing like that, but it was a major tax reform plan. So I would say, put together a plan, maybe take the leadership to Camp David, and out of that come a process. But have a plan that you put on the table. Not that every piece of it has to be accomplished, because it's not going to happen. Certain pieces you have to say, this is my line, but then work off of that, but then maybe set up a process earlier, because throwing it just back to the hill and letting it go on, it used to work. That tax reform worked. It took about a year and a half, almost 2 years, for Packwood and Rostenkowski and all the system to work. It's not as good as, I don't think it's able to operate as well as it did then, even though there are lots of flaws with it. So I would, but I would take a different tack and say, have your own plan that's really a real plan, put it out there, but then engage and expect lots of changes to it, and have a process set up, maybe with a side group that can drive it through.
And before Josh gives his answer, am I, as the president, more likely to succeed or less likely to succeed with divided government or unified government?
If you're the president, the government always feels divided. So
I would think, look at if you had both houses, you probably would be in a lot better shape to drive it through, at least something like you want. But divided government can get something done, but that just means that, take my example, if the president was to put the plan, you better put it together so that it's going to entice the other side and not offend everybody. So that's a difficult situation to do, but that's the reality.
Can I answer the last question first?
Sure.
And say, yeah, unified government if you have 60 in the Senate.
Well, that's a big assumption.
Yeah. Otherwise, divided government. You're going to be better off, or at least more likely to be able to reach a deal, I think. I agree with what both Andy and Bill said just now about how you would approach the president. The thing I would add for the president at the front end is you have to go soften up the public first, and you need to go out to the public and say, look, we're going to have a big political battle. You know, what's the struggle we're going to have on the Hill is going to be about defense spending versus domestic spending and so on, and that's going to be important, and we'll try to reach an accommodation on that, but it's a sideshow. The portion of the budget that needs to be addressed is the entitlement programs, and that nobody's done better than the Peterson Foundation at helping propagate that truth. And you need to prepare the American public for what none of the elected politicians want to deal with, which is changing the trajectory of growth in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. It all can be done. Nobody wants to do it. You have to go out and prepare the ground, make the case for that, and then do what Andy and Bill were talking about, which is come up with your own plan that it has some meat and specificity to it, then put in place a process by which you can arrive at some sort of accommodation. It turned out that the Bowles-Simpson Commission was a fantastic opportunity, a process opportunity for exactly that. And one of the reasons why I started with calling myself confident is that I thought at that moment we were actually very close to a political accommodation that could have been achieved with presidential leadership. And I would say to the next president, look for that next opportunity, because it needs to be done and it can be done.
Well, on that note, I do not wish on any of you to be required to serve in the Chief of Staff job again, but whoever the next president is, he or she would do well to have people of your caliber. Andy Card, Bill Daley, Josh Bolten, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.